Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Brazil was a great power. Brazil is a big country and it's actually the biggest country of South America. And if we look at the world map, we can clearly see that not only is Brazil big, but they also have a big ocean around them. They are having no big neighbors. Well, they are far away from most war zones and conflicts that exist in our timeline. And they are actually in a very good geographic position. Well, most Hearts of Iron 4 players, they will surely understand what I mean, that yeah, South America is in a sense boring. I mean in the sense of conflicts, but well, in this case South America won't be that boring, but still. Brazil has an enormous landmass, many resources, a lot of water, different landscapes, the Amazonas jungle of course, natural beauties, and yet it is not a powerful country. Sure, corruption can be stated as the main reason, but I think we have to look even further. Brazil also has a huge population, and funnily enough, almost half of South America's population speaks Portuguese. Yes, that's how big Brazil actually is. We have to put this into numbers. The population number is thus not the issue. What's then the issue? Well, while resource rich with coffee, cotton and sugar cane plantations, only a small amount of individuals they were educated in Brazil. And well, there were 8 times as many African slaves brought to Brazil as they were in the United States, for instance. As a result, the cheap, expandable, Brazilian plantation owners focused less on cultivation, a community of slaves via family and childbirth, and more on further importation, which in return disincentivized the industrialization of Brazil until several decades after the independence. If we look back, Brazil had no real industries and industrialized very late and had slavery for a long time. Thus, there was no need in industrializing the country. The elite was satisfied with slavery, and nobody of the elite wanted a change. We can compare Brazil in some sense with Russia, because in Russia you had for a long time also the other system, which was not slavery, but it was almost close to slavery, servitude for instance. And then again, Brazil and Russia, they are very big countries and they have masses, really big masses of lands which are totally unexploited until nowadays. So what if Brazil was a great power? The point of divergence I'm going to take is one that is proposed by the Reddit user ZRTTR. Thanks for your idea, ZRTTR. I found his alternate timeline on Reddit. In 1844, the finance secretary of the city of Rio de Janeiro, which was Brazil's largest port at the time, created a tax of 50 to 60% on British consumer goods in order to increase the city government's revenue. This had a very unpredicted effect of creating a small national industry, which rose up to fill the gap left by the now uncompetitive British products. Well, Britain, they were of course really angry about it, and the tax affected all British businesses in the country of Brazil, and they demanded the end of the Alves Branco tariff, as it was called. Peter II obliged, and Brazilian industrial development would be halted for many more years. However, in this new timeline, Peter II would not oblige to it. And what would happen next? Well, Britain would get that for sure, that's one point, but Peter II would expand these tariffs and also create new nationalized companies. This would be a great basis for the industrialization of Brazil. Britain would make a blockade with its navy, that's for sure, but in OTL Peter II faced something similar. in the 1860s, a British ship sank and was sacked on the shores of Brazil. The Brits would want an apology from the Brazilian crown. Peter II was able to manage the situation by leaning on Britain's European adversaries and saying that Brazil would go to war if needed. Britain was the one that ended up apologizing, actually. We can thus conclude that in such a scenario with the blockade, Peter II would make a similar move. Exports to Britain would go down, but on the other hand, Brazil would now have a basis to develop their own industries. Politically, the Brazilians would have better relations with the US, who would still be at odds with Britain in the 1840s. Brazil would export the agricultural product now not really to Britain, but to Britain's enemies, and develop a huge internal market for further industrial growth. This would give Brazil more initiative to ban slavery early on. As the elite would now also have money in the factories, some of them would see that more profits would be made in the factories, and the demand for workforces would not only increase immigration to Brazil, but also demands to free the slaves so that they could work in the factories or just, change positions and work in different factories and not be tied to one factory owner. The earliest industrialization also means the following. Certain empty parts of Brazil would suddenly fill up and would see factories emerge, railways and streets would be built, new cities would appear, and as a result we would not only have Manaus but many more cities like Manaus. The jungle would shrink faster in this timeline up to a certain moment only. Farming would still be a viable career and still get people a lot of money, but with factories, new cities, constructions and many more developments, more people would be needed for different stuff, and schools would be needed as well to train the population for different jobs and different careers. Some Brazilians would be sent to study at European universities to further enhance their knowledge and also their capacities to further enhance factories and industrial growth within Brazil. European experts, they would also be coming to Brazil, but only for a very short time until they would be replaced by native Brazilians who were educated enough to do the projects on their own. Probably some changes with Paraguay could happen, but I think that most likely the only thing that could change is that Brazil would finish up the conflict much faster that they had with Paraguay in OTL. Uruguay would be kept still as a Brazilian puppet state, and the US would still mediate a peace deal between the Paraguayans on one side and the Argentinians and the Brazilians. Brazil would have no reason yet to not have the US as ally, and the US would accept a strong Brazil, because it would help them to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, and honestly they would rather prefer a friendly Brazilian-dominated South America than one that is divided up and where Britain, France and all the European powers, they could just do whatever the hell they wanted. Slowly but surely the US would get less immigrants than it did in OTL. The effects would of course not be that devastating, and I also don't think that the US will suddenly become no global power anymore, but the population of the US will be a bit different. While Brazil's population will be more white than in OTL, and there will also still be problems with Afro-Brazilians, but with a public school system that is much better and early on developed, more career options, this could help the Afro-Brazilians in many ways. Another important point is that the society of Brazil was different than the society of former Spanish colonies, but yes, the situation of Afro-Brazilians would, even within an industrialized Brazil, not be that great because of the past of slavery. After a few more decades, farming will become less and less attractive, and the manufacturing industry will be booming like crazy. This will actually help the Amazon forest. With less people who want to have farming lands, less trees of the Amazon jungle that will be destroyed or burned down to win some farming lands. Many industries will be built around important cities, and the newly built cities close to certain resources, well, these cities, they would become a bit bigger. Yes, some trees and some of the nature would be cut down, but we wouldn't see any sudden bigger cities be built anymore. People will start to flee smaller settlements and move to the cities. In this ATL, Brazil will not only have bigger cities, but a more developed urbanization with less inequalities than in OTL. Sure, there will be bad areas and very dangerous ones, but not to the same degree as in OTL. Also, these bad and dangerous areas will be more mixed. Former slaves and newly arrived but uneducated immigrants will live there. You will then not only have the former slave areas that will be considered dangerous and bad areas like the favelas nowadays, but yeah, you will also see people who look like very rich Brazilians, but well, they are very poor. Brazilians will be more educated than in OTL, and many scientists, for instance, would give a huge boost to Brazil not only as a country, but to the technology, education, schools, and thus the Brazilian population as a whole. Brazilian experts would be sent to the neighboring countries such as Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and even European countries like Portugal, for instance. I also don't think that the monarchy will be replaced, and if it gets replaced, we will not see many different military dictatorships. One of the main reasons Brazil had so many different dictatorships and governments was that Brazil was too dependent on exporting raw materials, and with many industries and relying less on the export of raw materials, Brazil would make a leap forward in not only becoming a first world country, but a great power as well. With a more stable country, economy and growing population, Brazil could focus on foreign policies and get trade deals with several countries, even leading into an economic alliance with smaller neighboring countries. Brazil could also flex its muscles if some countries would not bow down to their will, and thus exert pressure on some neighboring countries. The Panama Canal could be an issue for Brazil in case it had Colombia as a puppet state or growing influence in there. The US would then try to argue that the Panama Canal would also be beneficial for Brazil, and they could even deliver and export stuff to the west coast, for instance, without paying a toll or just a very small fee. Yes, World War I and World War II will still happen, and Brazil could in one way or another intervene due to the economic ties they would have with the European countries, but I guess that they would have ties with many countries, but not really with Germany. Germany would produce almost the same type of goods as Brazil in this alternate timeline, and with less relying on raw materials, Brazil wouldn't really need a strong Germany where they could export their raw material to. They will stay neutral or softly support the Entente and later on the Allies in the World War II. In between the two wars, Brazil could also face some issues with Argentina, but due to the economic, demographic and military strength, any hot conflict would end up really badly for Argentina. During the Cold War, the Brazilians would become a bit more active and suppress communist movements within South America and have a few military interventions here and there, while the US would intervene all around the globe and only help the Brazilians if they would ask them for help. But as a great power, Brazil would not need the help of the US in that regards. The US and Brazil would have a tremendous respect for each other, split the Americas amongst themselves, but be allies against anyone who would want to set a foot to the Americas. Only a radical change of direction could put an end to the alliance of the US and a great power of Brazil. And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.